So today's video is day number 7. We've done a full week of 10 days of terror. If you are new to my channel, every single day up until Halloween and on Halloween I am uploading a new true crime video and it's called 10 Days of Terror. And I mean, there's only 3 days left after this, but if you do want to be a part of that, if you do want to see those videos, make sure you subscribe to my channel and you've got my notifications on. So like I said in yesterday's video, the video about Bible John, this is kind of like a part 2 to that, but kind of not at the same time. I would recommend watching yesterday's video before you watch this one, but you don't have to. But if you are like binge watching these videos, I would recommend going back and watching that one and then coming to this one because they kind of are linked but not kind of, maybe, who knows. That's for you to decide, but I recommend that you watch both of them. Don't matter what order, I suppose. So today we're going to be talking about another serial killer. Today we're going to be talking about Peter Tobin, who is one of Glasgow's, one of Scotland's most notorious serial killers, one of the UK's most notorious serial killers. And I'm going to structure this case a little bit different to my normal ones. I'm not going to do it in a biography style. I'm just going to kind of do it in the way that the police learn new things about this man. Anyway, all that being said, I feel like this has been a really long intro. Let me just give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This is all just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So Angelika Kluk was a 23-year-old Polish student studying Scandinavian studies in Poland. And then in the summer of 2006 she decided to go overseas, get a summer job, earn some money to be able to pay for her courses, but also learn English at the same time. So Angelika decided to move to a quiet town in Glasgow in Scotland named Anderston, and that was where she worked for the summer. There really wasn't much to do in Anderston in 2006, I don't know if it's the same now, but there was just a couple of pubs, a couple of shops, but just mainly houses. And the focal point of the whole town was St Patrick's Roman Catholic Church, where Angelika got a job as a cleaner for the summer. For this job, Angelika was paid in money, obviously, but also on top of that she was given a living quarters to stay in, she was given food to eat every single day, all the meals were catered for, so this job was pretty much ideal. Angelika was a very friendly, welcoming, smiley girl, and so she quickly befriended a lot of people, the priest, other workers at the church, people that would frequent the church quite often. Then on September 25th, 2006, Angelika didn't show up for her cleaning job and the priest realised that he hadn't actually seen her about the church all day. And so the priest went to her room in the living quarters to go and check on her, see if she was feeling okay, but she wasn't there. All of her belongings were there, but Angelika wasn't there. By the evening, Angelika still hadn't turned up, and by this point she hadn't been seen by anyone for 24 hours, and so the priest decided to report her as missing to the police. So police came to the church, they interviewed everyone they could, all the workers that were there, but none of them seemed to know anything. None of them really knew her that well since she didn't speak great English. No one was like best friends with her, so none of them were with her, none of them knew of anything, she hadn't told them anything that she was doing that day, and so police sent everyone home and said they'd carry on the investigation the next morning. So the next morning police got back to the church and they were going to re-question everyone about like where they were that day and everything, but then they noticed that the church handyman, Pat McLaughlin, hadn't shown up for work. Other people in the church confirmed that Pat McLaughlin never missed a day of work. He was a very hard worker and he'd never done this before, so everyone was immediately quite suspicious. So police continued their interviews with everyone that had turned up at the church that day, and it was found that Angelika Kluk was actually last seen in Pat McLaughlin's company the day before she went missing. So at this point, police considered Pat McLaughlin a person of interest and they needed to talk to him, they needed to interview him about Angelika, but obviously he wasn't there and they didn't have any way of contacting him. And for some reason the church didn't have a telephone number or an address on books or anything. I mean, it was a church, it wasn't like a massive business or whatever. They did, however, have a picture of him on the wall, like they have pictures of everyone that works at the church on the wall, and so they gave that picture to police. And so with no other option really, police decided to take this photo and put it on the news and hope that someone recognised Pat McLaughlin and gave his number or his address. So this picture aired on the news at around 1 or 2 minutes past 6, and by 5 past 6 Police phone lines were full of people ringing in to give information about this man in the picture, Pat McLaughlin. But a lot of these calls were saying the same thing, that that man in the picture wasn't called Pat McLaughlin, his name was Peter Tobin. So police went back and looked through all their records for a Peter Tobin, and they found that he was actually a convicted sex offender. They also found that Peter Tobin was actually wanted by police at the time for an attack on a woman a year before this. And so with that, mixed with his previous convictions, mixed with the fact that he'd gone missing, police realised that they probably had the right person. So as the search for Peter Tobin began, a search for Angelika Kluk began as well, because she was still missing. And so police started at the church, which was the only place anyone ever really saw her because she worked there. Within minutes of entering the church, one of the police officers noticed that the floor was raised slightly under the carpet in one part. And so they pulled this carpet back and they found a trapdoor in the floor leading to underground storage, which a lot of churches do have. And when they opened this trapdoor, they saw a bunch of bin bags, a bunch of tarpaulin, and then underneath that was the body of Angelika Kluk. She had her legs tucked up under her, probably done by the killer so that she could fit into this very tiny storage space, and her hands were actually peeking out from under the bags and tarpaulin. Her hands had actually been tied with cable ties and they were covered in blood, and that was all police could see at this point until her body was removed and these bags were removed. That was all they knew, and so they knew she was probably dead under there. A woman named Carol Rogers was the senior forensic scientist on the case, and it was her job to get down into this storage space with Angelika to do like testing and looking for evidence and things before everything was moved and taken out. And this underground space, like I said, was not big at all. It was tiny. It must have been such a disturbing experience to be down there with a dead body. The entrance to the space was actually so narrow that Carol couldn't fit down it with her pager on a belt, because that added just the tiniest bit more width and she couldn't fit through, so she had to actually take the pager off to be able to fit down into this space. And Carol was there in that underground space with Angelika's dead body for 3 hours, and she just had to gather as much evidence, as much information from the scene as she possibly could before it obviously had to be moved about. Quickly she realised that Angelika's body had been put there after she was killed. This wasn't where the murder took place. Obviously, due to the very narrow entrance into this space, if she'd been killed once she'd been put in there, there'd be blood around the floor surrounding the storage area, and there wasn't any blood anywhere actually around the scene, on the floor by the scene. There was no blood other than that on Angelika's body and coming out of Angelika's body. And also from the way that the blood had settled in Angelika's body and the discoloration on different parts of her skin, they could tell that that wasn't the position that she died in and remained in for a while. She was moved a while after death. So now the next step was to figure out where Angelika was actually killed, because that might have some kind of evidence as to who the killer was. And so the first place that police searched was actually the last place that Angelika was seen alive, the garage on the church. The garage of the church obviously wasn't used for cars or anything, it was more used as storage and kind of like a workshop for the church handyman, Peter Tobin. So they went into this garage and it was full of stuff because it was storage for the whole church. It had like ladders in it, it had decoration in it for different times of year. It was just full, so they knew that this was going to be a big job to search it. However, after being in the garage for just a couple of minutes, one of the police officers noticed a tiny little spot of blood on the floor, only a couple of millimeters in diameter. So police began searching the floor for more blood spots, and they just found more and more and more. They began circling each of these tiny little blood spots with a black marker just so that they were more noticeable once they stood up. And when they did, they counted over 30. And when they looked on the walls and on the ceiling, they were everywhere. They were all over the furniture in that room. They were just everywhere. Police quickly determined that these blood spots were from impact spatter and that this was the room in which Angelika Kluk was killed. And like I said, they found blood on the ceiling, and this is known as cast-off blood, which is when a weapon that is already covered in blood is swung back again and like spatters everywhere. And they could tell from this cast-off blood all the way on the ceiling that Angelika Kluk was probably hit many times with the same long weapon. Pathologists could tell from splinters in Angelika's head that she was probably struck several times with a wooden weapon. And when pieced together with the state of the garage, the state of the murder scene, police realised that the murder weapon was a missing table leg. Although this wasn't Angelika's actual cause of death, Tobin had just knocked her unconscious with this table leg. He then tied her wrists with cable ties, further assaulted her, and then put her onto a polythene sheet so that he could drag her around. At this point she was unconscious, so he could drag her body around without getting blood anywhere, like on the carpets, on the floor. So he dragged her unconscious body on this polythene sheet out of the garage, the outside way, back into the church near where the trapdoor was. He then raped her inside the church and stabbed her 16 times before then putting her body in this underground storage and then trying to cover it with the bags and the tarpaulin. And police know this because in her post-mortem, her body was tested for any kind of DNA samples and a semen sample was found inside her. So police tested this semen sample against the Scottish DNA database, hoping that a match would come up, but no matches were found. And then some officers requested that the DNA sample be tested against the national DNA database, so the whole of the UK rather than just Scotland, in hopes that maybe a match would be found elsewhere. And a match came back within minutes, and sure enough, it was 60-year-old Peter Tobin's DNA. Peter's fingerprints were also found on a bag wrapped around Angelika's body, and so they knew based on these two pieces of evidence that they definitely had the killer. At this point though, it had been around a week since anyone had seen Peter Tobin, or Pat McLaughlin as he was known when he was last seen, and so a nationwide manhunt began. His picture was all over newspapers, news channels, along with his real name, Peter Tobin, and people were also warned that he liked to give fake names or aliases. News channels also ran a warning that if anyone did see Peter Tobin, not to approach him because he is a very dangerous man, and they believed that he was capable of doing this all over again. And it wasn't long before Tobin was spotted, actually hundreds of miles away in London in England by a nurse in a hospital. Tobin had checked himself into a hospital in London under the name James Kelly, complaining of chest pains. And one of the nurses on this ward saw this James Kelly and thought he looked eerily similar to the picture that she'd seen on the news. So this nurse called the police, fearing the worst, that this was actually Peter Tobin, and when police got there, Peter didn't even try and lie, he just straight up admitted his identity. So police arrested him then and there in the hospital. Luckily he wasn't having any kind of serious surgeries or treatment or anything, so they could just take him and detain him. The next day after he was arrested, Peter was taken from London all the way back up to Scotland for his legal proceedings, since that was where the crime took place. His trial began in March of 2007, and despite pleading not guilty, Peter Tobin was found guilty of the rape and murder of Angelika Kluk. Throughout his trial, all the things that he was saying and all the details that were coming out about this murder, police were growing more and more suspicious that maybe this wasn't Peter's first murder. Everything he did was just so well thought out, he did it with such ease and with confidence. First of all, he was 60 years old when he killed Angelika Kluk, which is pretty old for a first kind of random murder. Don't get me wrong, some people do commit first murders later on in life. However, those murders are normally kind of crimes of passion. They're normally people that they know. It's very rare that someone waits until so late in their life to commit such a random kind of unprovoked sexually motivated attack. They normally start doing that back in their 20s or 30s. And police began fearing exactly that. Maybe Peter Tobin had started in his 20s and 30s and he was only just being caught now. And Tobin, like I said, handled Angelika's body and the whole crime scene and the whole getting rid of the body so well, it was almost as if it was from memory. And the way that he just carried on after the murder as if nothing happened, he was being questioned by police, he was talking with co-workers at the church, like he was just carrying on as if nothing happened, as if he'd done that before. That's really hard to do for a first time. And police also learned through the trial of Angelika Kluk that Peter Tobin often used fake names throughout his whole life and travelled up and down the UK constantly, like not even just up and down Scotland. He'd go all the way to the south of England and then go all the way back up to Scotland, and police were concerned that maybe there was a reason why he was doing those things. Maybe he was running away from something, maybe he was purposely trying to hide his identity because maybe police were onto him about a previous murder, who knows? And so police made the decision to look into Peter Tobin as a possible serial killer, although it wasn't going to be easy. Like I said, he travelled a lot and used a lot of fake names. He lived in England sometimes, lived in Scotland sometimes, so some of his criminal history will be with English police, some of it will be with Scottish police. And all the fake names and things that he used, it meant it was going to be really hard to piece together like jobs he worked at, or friends he had, or anything. It was like trying to track down multiple different people all at once. And so police set up a specific investigation into the life and past of Peter Tobin named Operation Anagram. And basically Operation Anagram was going to track Peter Tobin's life right back to the beginning, right back to his birth, and then build it all up from there with all these different fake names, all these relationships, all these jobs, to get to where we are now at the killing of Angelika Kluk. And so with this new timeline of Peter Tobin's life, they could see where he was at certain points in his life, and with that they could kind of compare that to old police records. So say that Peter Tobin was in Glasgow in 1991. They could have a look on police records and see if there were any unsolved murders or disappearances in Glasgow in 1991. And if any of them looked promising enough, they could look into Peter Tobin as the suspect. So as I said, they traced Peter Tobin right back to his birth. His full name was Peter Britton Tobin, and he was born on August 27th, 1946 in Renfrewshire in Scotland. He was the second of 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. His father worked for the local council and his mother was a stay-at-home mother. Peter's and many other families in their area were working class. They lived in a relatively poor area of Scotland. His family were all Irish Catholic, and even though Peter wasn't devout to his religion, he still maintained his Christianity all the way through his life. So Peter's parents raised their children with very little compassion. They were more like property rather than human beings to be loved and nurtured. And because of this parenting style, none of the Tobin children ever had good relationships with their parents, and this quickly started showing in their behaviour. There's reports that Peter and all of his siblings would all be violent to each other, and the parents would just kind of watch it and not put a stop to it. At just 6 years old, Peter Tobin began misbehaving in school and also picked up a hobby of theft and burglary at 6 years old. And because of this, in 1953, at age 7, Peter Tobin was sent to an approved school. So an approved school, also known as a reformed school, is basically a boarding school where children are sent if they commit offences or if they are completely out of their parents' control. And Peter Tobin was both of those, honestly. Not that his parents really cared that he was out of their control, but even if they did try to discipline him, it wouldn't have worked. And these reform schools back in the 1950s were brutal with the way that teachers would treat the kids, the regimes that the school had. It just wasn't a nice environment for a child to grow up in at all. It was then, when he left school in his teens and early 20s, that Peter Tobin began moving about, using different names, and he stepped up a lot of his crime and he got arrested multiple times. At age 21 in 1968, Peter Tobin was a regular attendee of the Barrowland Ballroom in Glasgow, and there he met a girl. Margaret Mountney was only 16 years old when 21-year-old Peter Tobin approached her at the Barrowland and asked for a dance. He was well dressed, he was attractive, he was polite, he was charming, and Margaret was completely taken with Peter straight away. And after that night, Margaret and Peter kept in touch and they began a relationship. And everything was perfect for a while. They would go dancing every weekend. He would pick her up and get her home on time every weekend. They would go driving in his car. Margaret said to all her friends that she really thought that she found the man that she was going to marry. But unknown to everyone around them, and even to Margaret herself, Peter Tobin was wearing her down. He was draining her self-esteem, making her dependent on him, and Margaret didn't even know that this was going on. And then one day in 1969, the two of them were just round at Peter's flat as normal when he asked her to stay over for the first time. And Margaret just politely turned him down. She was still very young, she would have to ask her mum first, and besides, at this point it was getting pretty late, and so she said she actually had to go. Peter was practically begging Margaret to stay over for the night, but she said, "No, I can't," and so she got up to walk to the door. It was then Peter Tobin jumped up and got between Margaret and the door so that she couldn't leave. And for the next year and a half, Peter Tobin kept his girlfriend Margaret borderline kidnapped in their flat. She was rarely allowed out to see parents and friends. She was allowed out from time to time unsupervised, but when she was home, she was Peter's property. He would physically abuse Margaret, he would rape her whenever he pleased, he would monitor her constantly. She wasn't even allowed to the bathroom by herself. Peter Tobin had to come and stand inside the bathroom with her when she used the toilet, when she had a shower, anything, because he was scared that she might try and escape. And then one time in 1970, Peter went to rape Margaret once again, as he'd done many times before. But this time Margaret protested. She begged him not to, and she even said she would rather he killed her than continue to treat her like this. And it was then when Peter just got off Margaret and walked out of the room. And then Margaret started panicking. She thought there was no way that he just stopped just because she asked him to. Surely he's mad now. And Peter was mad. He returned back into the bedroom with a long serrated knife that he'd got from the kitchen. He then thrust it inside of Margaret and twisted it around. And then Peter just got up and left the flat, presumably just leaving Margaret to die, and she almost did. She actually bled so much that her blood soaked through the floorboards and onto the ceiling of the flat below theirs. And she was so close to bleeding to death had it not been for a neighbour that heard her screams and came and knocked the door down. Luckily, the neighbour could call an ambulance and they saved Margaret's life. However, she was in a very bad way. The attack left Margaret in a coma for 3 weeks and she will never be able to have children, on top of obviously all the emotional scarring and trauma that came with it as well. After a month or so of hospital treatments, Margaret was then discharged back into the care of Peter Tobin. And after this incident, Peter started to get a little bit concerned that maybe people around them were catching on to their abusive relationship. Margaret said that at the time she never told anyone how she sustained those injuries, and I don't know what excuse she gave, because surely she gave an excuse because those are very hard injuries to acquire accidentally. And Peter feared that maybe friends and family, or maybe even the neighbour that found her bleeding to death in their apartment, would get suspicious that maybe Peter had something to do with those injuries. And so he picked up Margaret and they moved. He took Margaret almost 500 miles away from her friends and family, from her old life, all the way to Brighton in England. And there he told her that they were getting married. And Margaret at this point just felt like there was no way out. There was nothing she could do to stop this marriage. There was nothing she could do to get out of this relationship with Peter. And so she just let it happen. So the two of them got a flat together in Brighton, and once again Peter would rarely let her leave. If he did let her leave, she was only allowed out for certain times. And when he would leave the apartment, he would lock her in a certain room. So not just lock her in the apartment, but he would lock her either in the bedroom or even the bathroom sometimes. And before long, Peter started to notice how depressed and lonely Margaret was getting in that apartment by herself all this time. And so he came up with a solution. Instead of letting her out more, letting her have a social life, letting her see friends, or even instead of him staying home a little bit more and keeping her company, he didn't want to do either of those, so he bought her a dog instead. He bought her a little black collie dog that Margaret named Butte, and that dog was supposed to be a substitute for human interaction. And Butte was only a puppy. He was only 10 weeks old when they adopted him, and so he was going through being trained. He was barking a lot because he was only tiny, and that's what puppies do. And then one day, on the rare occasion that Peter let Margaret out of the flat, she went out and then she came home and noticed that she couldn't see the dog anywhere. So she asked Peter what he'd done with Butte, and he said he was sick of it barking and peeing everywhere, and so he threw it out of the window. But it turns out he'd done more than just throw this puppy out of the window. He'd actually beheaded this 10-week-old puppy. That same night, Margaret heard noise outside of the flat, and so she looked outside and she saw just a group of teenage boys playing football outside of the flat. But when she looked closer, she realised that they weren't kicking about a football, they were kicking about her puppy's head. But then after a few months of living in Brighton, Peter Tobin was once again arrested for a theft that he'd committed in Glasgow while they were there. And so he and Margaret were taken back up to Glasgow for questioning. So the two of them spent the night in cells, and then the following morning they realised that Margaret wasn't guilty of this, it was just Tobin's crime, and so they let her go. So Tobin remained in his cells for questioning to do with that crime, whereas Margaret was picked up by her parents the following morning. And that was actually the first time Margaret had seen her parents in over a year. And it was then she was finally able to escape Tobin, and she actually divorced him in 1971. In the 2 years following this divorce, Tobin was imprisoned another 2 times and then married again in 1973. This time to a 30-year-old nurse named Sylvia Jeffries that he met in Brighton. But once again, as I'm sure you can imagine, the marriage was abusive again on Peter's part, both emotionally and physically. The two of them had 2 children together, a boy and a girl, and the girl, named Daisy Ann, actually passed away shortly after birth. After suffering 3 years of abuse at the hands of Peter Tobin, Sylvia finally decided to take her son and leave and divorce Peter Tobin in 1976. For the next decade, Peter Tobin was in and out of prison for theft, forgery. He could never hold down a job. He could rarely get jobs because of his criminal past. And so to make money, he was robbing more, and then he was getting caught for that and being put back in prison, and it was just this vicious cycle that he was in. And then in 1987, when Peter Tobin was 41 years old, he met 16-year-old Kathy Wilson, and the two of them began a relationship. Kathy had been brought up in foster care and by different family members all her life, and was actually living by herself at the age of 16 when she met Peter Tobin. And she was very vulnerable, and she's admitted herself that she was very easy to manipulate at that stage in her life. 1, she was very young, and 2, she'd been through a lot. She was looking for someone to give her the love and attention that she needed. And that's the thing, Peter Tobin always seemed to go for women that he thought were going to be easy to manipulate because he liked to have a lot of power in relationships. Once again, the abuse began very early on in the relationship, and after just a couple of months, Kathy actually fell pregnant by Tobin. And even during the 9 months that Kathy Wilson was carrying his own child, he was still regularly abusive to her. In 1987, Kathy gave birth to their son Daniel, and just a few months later, when she turned 17, her and Peter got married. The three of them moved around a lot between different rented houses. Peter was actually unemployed the whole time and just committing different crimes to earn money. And then a year into this marriage, Peter picked up the whole family again and moved them 500 miles away from Brighton in England all the way to Bathgate in Scotland. He persuaded Kathy to move all that way by saying that he'd found a really cheap 3-bedroomed house, there was a really nice big garden for their son to play in, and obviously she wanted the best for her son and her family, so she agreed. But once they moved, Peter got a lot more violent and began beating Kathy daily.
From my point of view, I've gone through so many atrocities when I was a child that actually someone throwing you up against a wall and putting their hand around your neck and calling you horrible names isn't that bad. I really think I was just a possession. And I think the anger from him was that the possession was not conforming the way it was meant to conform. That's all it was. I don't think there was any love there at all.
After a while, Kathy then noticed that the abuse was taking a toll on her son Daniel, and she knew that she needed to protect him from witnessing this. But when she told Peter that she was leaving and that she was taking Daniel with her, Peter completely flipped. Peter told Kathy that if she tried to leave, he would kill their son Daniel while Kathy watched. Then he would kill Kathy, and then he would kill himself. And after Kathy had said that, Peter didn't let her or Daniel out of his sight for 3 whole months because he was that scared that she was going to leave him. And then one day in 1990, Peter left the house for a full day, and Kathy saw her opportunity to escape. She grabbed Daniel, she grabbed some money that she'd been saving over time, and she went to the bus station and got a bus all the way back to Hampshire in England. But Peter Tobin, despite treating Kathy really badly, he seemed to adore their son Daniel. He was never violent, never even aggressive, he never shouted or laid a finger on his son at all. And after Kathy left him, Peter still wanted to see his son, and so he went through the courts and got granted regular access. And to be able to get this regular access, Peter decided to leave his home in Glasgow and move all the way down to England so that he could be closer to Daniel. In 1991, he got a house in Margate in Kent where he would regularly have Daniel over to stay. He stayed there for a couple of years before moving even closer to Daniel and getting a flat in Hampshire. On August 4th, 1993, Tobin had 5-year-old Daniel round at his flat to stay over for the night. And then at around 9 o'clock that night, Peter heard knocking outside, although it wasn't on his door. It was 2 girls, one aged 14 and one aged 15, knocking on Peter's neighbour's door to see if their friend was in. At this point, the girls had been knocking for a while, and it seemed as though the neighbour wasn't in, and so Peter went to his door and asked if the girls wanted to wait inside his flat for the neighbour to come home. So the girls said okay, they were all sat in the living room, Peter, his son and these 2 girls, and then Peter decided to finally put 5-year-old Daniel to bed. So he did that, and then he came back into the living room, and then he turned on the charm with these 2 girls. However, this time it wasn't working. And this had never really happened to Peter before. He was normally very good at choosing his targets. He knew what kind of women would just fall for him and do what he said. But this time he didn't get to pick his target, did he? This was very opportunistic. These girls literally appeared on his doorstep. And so Tobin realised he'd have to go about this a different way. And so he went to the kitchen and made the girls some drinks. And these drinks were a mixture of cider, vodka and a drug he'd crushed up named amitriptyline, and he threatened the girls with a knife to drink it. Before long, the girls were borderline knocked out. They were still conscious, but they couldn't move their own body, they couldn't do anything, and that was when Peter began the assault. He raped and sodomized both girls and then stabbed the younger of the 2 several times. It was only when 5-year-old Daniel woke up and walked into the room as this assault was taking place that Peter Tobin finally stopped. Tobin actually asked his 5-year-old son to go to the kitchen, get some ice from the freezer and bring it to him so that he could put it on this girl's wounds. Peter then called his ex-wife Kathy and asked her if she could come over and pick Daniel up because Peter wasn't feeling very well, he was having chest problems and he wanted to go to the hospital and get them checked over.
So I took Daniel from him at the front door and I said, do you want me to wait for the ambulance to arrive? You know, you okay? He said, no, I don't feel quite so bad now, but still take him because I think I will go and be checked, have a check-up. I put my son in the car and we came home and went to bed.
Once Kathy left with Daniel, Peter turned on all of the gas taps in his apartment and left. And it's believed that he left the girls there believing that they would die of asphyxiation. But luckily they didn't. The girls came round after a couple of hours, they managed to escape the flat and then called the police. And obviously because this whole assault had taken place in one person's flat, they knew exactly who to look for, Peter Tobin. But by the time police went to question and arrest him, Peter had taken off. Peter had taken on a fake name, went and joined a religious sect in Coventry and wasn't found for 40 days. In 1994, Peter Tobin pled guilty to the attack and served 10 years of a 14-year sentence before being released in 2004 at the age of 58. On his release from prison, Peter Tobin decided to move back to Glasgow in Scotland, and because he was now a registered sex offender, he always had to tell police where he was going. They had to constantly monitor him. And not long after his release from prison, Tobin met yet another young girl that he could manipulate and win over with his charm, his new neighbour named Debbie. They would go to each other's flats and drink and talk together, and luckily police got word of this friendship between Debbie and Peter, and they actually got involved and spoke to Debbie. They basically sent Debbie a letter just saying that Peter Tobin was a registered sex offender for the rape of 2 teenage girls. And as you can imagine, Debbie was horrified. So she went and confronted Peter about it, and Peter was very defensive. He said that none of it was true and that he was actually going to seek legal advice for these malicious rumours that were being spread about him. And Debbie believed him, and their friendship continued as normal until 2005 when Peter actually moved to a different flat and groomed a different young woman. This woman was named Cheryl McLaughlin, and she used to see Peter about town all the time. They used to smile at each other every time for months. And then one day they saw each other again. She smiled at him, but this time he came over and asked her to go for a drink, and she did. And the date went well, and the two of them began seeing each other. And then one day Cheryl went over to her boyfriend Peter Tobin's house for a coffee. After a while, Cheryl got up to leave, and that was when Peter Tobin jumped up, grabbed a knife, put it to her throat, and then asked her to lay on the floor, presumably so that he could rape her. But Cheryl had been in the army, she'd been raised alongside 8 brothers, she knew how to defend herself, and so she managed to wrestle the knife off of Tobin, but she actually cut her arm in the process. She then opened the door to run out, but as she did, she dropped the knife, and Peter picked it back up and began chasing her with this knife again. And it was at this point that Peter realised that Cheryl was probably going to get away from him, and if she did, he would be in big trouble, and so he thought of another plan. Peter Tobin pretended to have a heart attack whilst chasing his girlfriend with a knife, hoping that she would stop and come back and look after him. And she did. She went back, she was looking after him for a while, and then she persuaded him to go to the front door to get some fresh air. And when they did, as soon as that door opened, Cheryl ran. And Peter, knowing that once Cheryl was out, she was going to go to the police, she was going to tell them exactly what Peter had done to her, he knew that he had to run as well. But at this point, Operation Anagram loses Peter Tobin's trail. So Cheryl was taken to hospital where she was being treated for the cut on her arm that she got during this altercation, and police came and visited her the next morning to tell them that they'd gone to Peter's flat to go and arrest him, but when they kicked the door down, he'd gone. Over the next few months, Peter stayed in a range of different hostels all over Scotland before eventually settling down in Anderston. And from there we know the story. He took on the fake name Pat McLaughlin and became a handyman at the local church where he killed Angelica Cluke. And this brings us back to the timeline. Peter Tobin has just been arrested for his first murder, although police believe there must be more. On a search of Peter Tobin's home, police found a hoard of women's jewellery. Although Peter didn't have a wife, he didn't live with any women, so whose jewellery was all of that? Police feared that maybe all these different bits of jewellery were actually trophies that he'd taken from his victims over the years. So according to Operation Anagram, Peter Tobin's first conviction for a serious crime was in 1993 for the rape of those 2 girls when he was 47 years old. But 47 is still pretty old to be doing your first ever serious crime. Police believe that he must have been doing them way before that. And he seemed to carry out this attack on these girls with a lot of confidence, like he'd drugged someone before, like he'd stabbed someone before, like he'd raped someone before. And so police decided to look into the gaps in Operation Anagram where it seemed as though Peter Tobin was laying low for a while out of fears that maybe he wasn't laying low at all. And one of these kind of quieter periods in Peter Tobin's life lined up perfectly with one of the biggest unsolved disappearances in Scottish history. So Vicky Hamilton was a 15-year-old girl from Falkirk in Scotland, and she'd been missing since 1991. Vicky was one of 4 siblings, 2 of which still lived at home with Vicky and the parents, and her older sister actually had her own place. Vicky was very friendly, she was very lively, she had a lot of friends, she always did really well in school. And then on February 10th, 1991, Vicky set off from her sister's home back to her family home. Her journey home was around an hour long, and it involved one bus change in a town called Bathgate, the town that Peter Tobin lived in at the time. So she got on her first bus, and then she got to Bathgate, where she got off of the bus, she went and got some fish and chips, and then she sat at the bus stop waiting for her second bus. And that was the last ever sighting of Vicky Hamilton, at that bus stop eating her fish and chips, and she never actually got on the second bus. And like I said, this was one of the biggest disappearances in Scottish history. Vicky's face and name were everywhere. For weeks there was barely any developments in this case at all. That was until one day Vicky's purse was found at Edinburgh bus station. And this bus station where the purse was found was 20 miles away from where Vicky was last seen, in the opposite direction of where she was headed. And so this gave police a theory that maybe Vicky had run away off of her own accord. It's relatively common for teenagers that go missing in Scotland to later be found in London, in England, after trying to run away. And so police theorised that maybe she was doing that. But Vicky was only 15 and she didn't have a right lot of money. Obviously she didn't have a job or anything, so what money was she moving to London with? And besides, it was way out of Vicky's character to ever do anything like that. She was relatively still dependent on her parents. I mean, she was only 15. And she would never do anything without telling a parent or at least a friend or a sibling first. She would never move to a different country without telling anyone. So police continued to look into Vicky's disappearance, but with lack of evidence, with lack of witnesses, the case quickly went cold. That was until 2007. When Operation Anagram became a thing in 2007, police realised that Peter Tobin was living in Bathgate at the time of her disappearance, and so police went back and searched Peter Tobin's Bathgate home that he lived in 1991, so many years before this. And unbelievably, 15 years after Peter had moved out of this house, police found a knife hidden inside of one of the house walls. And this knife even had a substance on it that police believed was a piece of human skin. Although that was all they found. They didn't find any evidence of Vicky or her body anywhere in that house. So the knife was forensically tested along with that flesh substance, and both of them had DNA profiles of Vicky Hamilton on them. Vicky's purse was also forensically tested at the time of her disappearance in 1991, but nothing was found. However, now in 2007, with improved technology, police decided to do it again. And this time police found male DNA on this purse. However, it wasn't Peter Tobin's. It was very similar to Peter Tobin's, but it wasn't a match to his. And it was then that police remembered that Peter Tobin actually had 2 sons who would obviously have very similar DNA to him, and so their DNA samples were taken. And a match was found to Peter Tobin's son Daniel, who was just 3 years old at the time of the disappearance. And since Peter was serving time for the murder of Angelica Kluke, police could call on him any time and ask for a questioning, and that is exactly what they did after they received these DNA results. So Peter was presented with the knife that they'd found in his house, and he was just asked general questions, to which he said he'd once owned a knife that looked very similar to that one. But then when police told him the significance of this knife and about the DNA profiles that they'd found on it, he suddenly said he'd never seen that knife before in his life. And the same with Vicky Hamilton herself. He said he'd never heard of her before in his life, he'd never seen her, he'd never met her. And at this point, police knew that Peter had something to do with Vicky Hamilton's disappearance, but without a confession or without a body, they couldn't charge him, and so all they could charge him for was abduction. And it's believed that his son Daniel's DNA was on her purse because he actually gave it to him as a toy to play with after he'd killed or abducted Vicky Hamilton. Meanwhile, Operation Anagram was also looking into a separate unsolved disappearance back in Hampshire when Peter lived there. In August of 1991, so just 6 months after the disappearance of Vicky Hamilton from Scotland, Another girl went missing from Hampshire in England. 18-year-old student Dinah McNichol was last seen on August 5th, 1991. She lived in Essex, but at the time of her disappearance she was actually attending a music festival in Liphook in Cheshire with a bunch of friends. So during the festival, Dinah met a boy who she got on really well with, and then at the end of the festival he said that he was staying on for an extra day, as many campers did. Dinah's friends had to be home for Monday morning, so they had to leave on the Sunday evening, but Dinah decided to stay over with this boy and all of his friends. And then when it came time for them to leave the festival the next morning, they were all going to hitchhike home. They all lived in the same kind of area apart from Dinah. And so Dinah and this boy decided to hitchhike together as a pair, although he didn't live quite as far down south as she did. So they got to the M25, the two of them parted ways. This boy was going to hitchhike in a different direction and Dinah continued in the car with this man. And after that, Dinah was never seen again, and immediately when she didn't return home that night, her family knew that something was wrong. See, this was a time before mobile phones, but Dinah and her whole family were all very good at communicating, even without mobile phones. If plans changed or if they were going to be late or something, they'd go to a phone box or they'd borrow someone's phone. They would never leave the rest of their family wondering where they were, and this was nothing like Dinah to do that. The only clue that police had was that Dinah's bank card was still being used even after her disappearance. Dinah's mother had recently passed away and left her £2,000, which was in her bank account when she went missing. And it was very strange that Dinah was using that money because she'd expressed to everyone, family, friends, even her mother before she passed, that she was going to use that money to go travelling one day. So police found that Dinah's bank card was being used in Margate in Kent. However, this didn't turn up any more leads. They searched Margate but didn't find Dinah. And it wasn't until 2007 when police realised that Peter Tobin lived in Margate in Kent at the time of Dinah's disappearance. This home in Margate was the first place that he moved when he came down from Glasgow to be closer to his son Daniel. So police went and spoke to Peter's neighbours from that home just to get an idea of what Peter was like as a neighbour, just the kind of things that would go on. And Peter's neighbour Dave Martin recalled him being a very good neighbour. He was never really noisy, he would always lend him things if he needed. The two of them would often talk over the fence if they were both out at the same time, and the conversations were normally really good, apart from one. One day the two men were stood outside of their front doors just having a conversation over the fence when two teenage girls walked past, and Peter Tobin pointed out how good looking they were. And Dave was a little bit taken aback by that comment, but he just kind of laughed it off, saying, "Pete, you're old enough to be their dad." And Peter laughed as well, saying, "You know what, you're right actually." And then police asked Dave if Peter was ever into any kind of DIY, housework, gardening, anything like that. And Dave actually laughed at that question from police because he said he'd never seen Peter do anything like that in his life. But then he remembered one strange instance. After a couple of months of living in his Margate home, Dave looked out of the window and saw his neighbour Peter Tobin digging a rather deep hole in his back garden. So Dave went outside to talk to Peter and he made a joke about how deep he was digging this hole. He said, "Are you trying to dig your way to Australia?" And Peter laughed and said, "No, it's just a sandpit that he's building for his son as a surprise when he comes over at the weekend." And while Dave thought that this hole was a bit deep for a sandpit, he also thought, well, what do I know about sandpits? That might be the ideal depth for a sandpit. And Tobin said to him, "If you're gonna do it properly." And that was why he made it so big. It was around 7 foot by 4 foot to be exact. But then a couple of days later, Dave looked out of the window and noticed that the hole had been filled up with soil again. So Dave asked him what had happened to this sandpit, and Peter told him that the social worker actually deemed it unsafe for his son, and so he had to fill it back in. And obviously when Dave told police about this years later, they were immediately suspicious, and so they got a warrant to do forensic excavations in Peter's old home. And so police began digging exactly where this sandpit was being built, and they found human remains, although they weren't the remains of Dinah McNichol like they were expecting. Quickly identified by her jewellery, these human remains seemed to belong to 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton. And if you remember, Vicky was last seen, she went missing in Scotland, but her body was found 500 miles away in the south of England. And Vicky's body showed signs of a brutal murder. She'd actually been cut into two, so her torso and her legs were two separate pieces. Both parts of her body were put into bin bags. There were 13 over her torso and 11 over her legs, and then she was buried in the garden. So police theorised that Peter had lured Vicky from the bus stop in Bathgate to his home, and there they believe that he killed her on the same day using that knife that police found. They believe he then cut her up, wrapped her body in bin liners and kept her in the back of his van until he bought a new house down south. He then then drove 500 miles down to the south of England with Vicky's body still in the back of his van. And Dave, the neighbour from Margate, actually recalled on Peter's moving day he had some black bin liners in the back of his van. And due to her being wrapped in these bin liners so tightly, her body was barely decomposed, and so she was easily identified. And because Vicky's body was so well preserved, her post-mortem could reveal her cause of death quite easily, even after all these years. The post-mortem revealed that she'd been drugged and her cause of death was actually strangulation. She also had marks all over her chest, believed to have been where Tobin was actually kneeling on her body as he was strangling her. So after the discovery of Vicky Hamilton's body, police believed that if they kept going, if they kept digging up this garden, they were sure to find Dinah McNichol's body. And sure enough, 2 days later, when they got onto the last patch of garden, they found the body of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol. Dinah's body was actually all in one piece, but once again wrapped up very tightly and buried only a few metres away from Vicky Hamilton's body. Dinah's cause of death couldn't actually be established from her post-mortem, but it was found that she was drugged by drugs prescribed to Peter Tobin at the time. So obviously when police discovered these other two bodies, Peter was already serving a life sentence for the murder of Angelica Kluke, and so they added on another 2 murder charges, making Peter Tobin now officially a serial killer. He was first found guilty of the murder of Vicky Hamilton, and 30 years were added onto his sentence for that. And then 7 months after that, Peter Tobin was due to stand trial for the murder of Dinah McNichol. However, that had to be postponed because once again Peter Tobin faked a heart attack. Psychologists have since diagnosed Peter Tobin as a psychopath, a typical behaviour of which is a need to control the situation. Peter felt in this situation as if he wasn't in control. He knew he was about to be found guilty for the murder of Dinah McNichol, and he thought, what can I do to regain control of this? Peter knew that if he was suddenly seriously ill, everything would have to stop for him and police would have to pay attention to him and do things for him, and that would give him the power back. So eventually Peter's trial resumed and his old neighbour Dave was brought up to testify against him. And when Dave walked up to the stand, Peter saw him, he smiled, he put his thumbs up and said, "Hi Dave, haven't seen you in a while, how's it going?" This man is on trial for the murder of a young girl, yet when he sees his old friend that is giving evidence against him to say that he is a murderer, he puts his thumbs up and asks him how he's been doing. But anyway, after just 3 days of trial, Peter Tobin was once again found guilty of murder, and this added another life sentence onto his existing huge sentence. So altogether he had 1 life sentence for Angelica Kluke's murder, 30 years for Vicky Hamilton's, and another life sentence for Dinah McNichol's. So Peter Tobin will never be out of prison. So Peter Tobin is officially believed to have committed 9 murders/assaults, all of which we've just talked about in this video. However, police believe there to be a lot more. And Tobin himself claims that he's actually killed 48 women in his life, although there's no evidence for any of those other than the ones that he's been sentenced for. So officially, in the eyes of the law, Tobin's first murder was Vicky Hamilton when he was 45 years old. But as I've been saying all the way through this video, 45 is still rather old to commit your first random murder. And again, he did it with such callousness. He cut her body in 2, wrapped it up and buried it in his garden. That shows some confidence when it comes to murder and dead bodies and things. The average person wouldn't be able to react like that to a first murder. I mean, yes, Peter Tobin was diagnosed as a psychopath, but it was like he knew what he was doing. He had this knowledge based on previous murders. And dismembering a body, professionals say that that is not easy to do. It's nothing like dismembering an animal, like a butcher or something. As you can imagine, it's very mentally traumatic for the person doing it, but it's also very just physically hard to do. If you've never done it before, if you don't know the correct ways to go in, it's hard to do. And so Operation Anagram continued because they thought, no way did he start at 45 years old, surely there's some even before this. And they found a further 7 unsolved murders and disappearances that they believe could be connected to Peter Tobin, but at the same time they've got no conclusive evidence for any of these that I'm about to talk about. The first of which was 18-year-old Louise Kay, who went missing from Eastbourne in 1988. At the time of her disappearance, Tobin was living in Brighton in England and worked in Eastbourne, just a mile away from where she went missing. Although Louisa's body has never been found and no definite links have ever been made to Peter Tobin, in 1980, 22-year-old student Jessie Earle went missing again very close to Eastbourne. Her body was found 9 years later and her wrists were bound by her own bra, so her death definitely wasn't accidental or natural. It was obviously a murder, and a very traumatic one at that, yet her killer has also never been found. And before that, there was Pamela Exall in 1974, who went missing while on a walk on a beach in Norfolk. And Pamela's family have actually come forward since Peter Tobin's been found to be a serial killer and everything, saying that some of the jewellery that police found in his house looks very similar to some of the jewellery that Pamela owned. Before Pamela was 18-year-old Susan Long, who was sexually assaulted and strangled to death in 1970. Susan had been out dancing that night and her body was found the next morning by the milkman. Then finally, the last 3 murders believed to have been committed by Peter Tobin are the Bible John murders. I did a whole video on the Bible John case yesterday. If you do want to stick around for the Bible John bit, or if you do just want to skip forward, I've got some more information after the Bible John theories if you already saw yesterday's video and you don't want to sit through it twice. Just skip to this time if you want to go and see some updates on Peter Tobin and his prison life and his family. I'm basically just going to talk about all the same things that I talked about in yesterday's video, so I'm sorry if you've seen that one. However, in the context of this case, some of the things might click a little bit more in your brain. Because a lot of you, way more than I expected, commented on yesterday's video saying that you felt like the killer was not Peter Tobin, that Bible John was not Peter Tobin. So basically, if you don't know and if you haven't seen yesterday's video, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of who Bible John is and his connections to Peter Tobin. So Bible John is actually a whole other serial killer that committed 3 murders in 1968 and 1969 in Glasgow in Scotland. And a lot of people believe that Bible John is Peter Tobin. Because Bible John has never been found, no one knows who he is, and so people believe that those murders could have been committed by Peter Tobin. So Bible John, very much like Peter Tobin, targeted specifically petite, brown-haired, brown-eyed women. Like I said, he committed 3 murders, all of which he picked up his victims from the Barrowland Ballroom in Glasgow. He had 3 victims over the 2 years, the first of which was 25-year-old Patricia Docker. She went out dancing on the Thursday evening at the Barrowland Ballroom, and the next morning her body was found. She'd been beaten, raped and strangled to death, it's believed by the attacker's own belt, and she was found naked with the exception of 1 shoe. Another important detail to note is that Patricia was actually on her period at the time of her murder, and her murderer had left her sanitary towel by her body on purpose. The next murder wasn't for another 1.5 years. This time it was 32-year-old Jemima McDonald. Once again, Jemima went dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom and she was killed that night, and her body was found 2 days later in an abandoned building. Again, she'd been beaten and raped, although this time she wasn't found naked, she was actually partially clothed, and she was also strangled to death, but this time by her own stocking. Once again, Jemima was on her period and her sanitary towel was left by her body. And witnesses say that they saw Jemima leaving the Barrowland Ballroom with a man of about 6 foot in height with reddish hair. And the last of the Bible John murders was 29-year-old Helen Puttock, who attended the Barrowland Ballroom and again was found murdered the next morning. Once again, she was beaten, raped and strangled with her own stocking. And once again, Helen was on her period at the time of the murder. However, this time her killer had left her sanitary towel under her arm intentionally, possibly because it was a windy night and he felt that that was a very important detail for his murders, and so he wanted to make sure it was still there when police found the body. So Helen, on the night that she attended the Barrowland Ballroom, actually attended with her sister Jeannie, so someone was with her all night. And at one point Helen got talking and dancing with a man who introduced himself as John, and Jeannie remembered his surname as either Templeton, Sempleson or Emerson. She couldn't quite remember. The 3 of them, Helen, her sister Jeannie and this John guy, all got a taxi home together, and Jeannie was the first drop-off, leaving John and Helen in the taxi by themselves that night. But before she did leave the taxi, she got to know John a little bit, and she quickly realised that he was very religious. Or he seemed to be religious. He was always referencing stories from the Bible, but they were actually used out of context. He told the 2 women this story from the Bible about an adulterous woman that got stoned to death, which is an unusual topic of conversation for the first time that you've met 2 women. And because of this interaction, interaction that Jeannie had with this guy, that is why he is known as Bible John, because the name that he gave was John and he loved the Bible. And Helen's sister Jeannie, because she got quite a good look at this guy in the taxi, she was able to make a police sketch. And it does kind of look like Peter Tobin facially. So let's go through the reasons of why Peter Tobin might or might not be Bible John. First of all, the description. Yes, facially he looks very similar to the police sketch. However, that is literally the only thing that is alike between Peter Tobin and Bible John's appearances. Bible John was reported to be around 6 foot tall with reddish hair, and that was by multiple different witnesses. Whereas Peter Tobin was actually 5'6", a whole half a foot shorter. You can't mistake that. And Peter Tobin also had dark brown hair, not red hair. And Helen's sister Jeannie, the woman that shared a taxi ride with this man, said that when she saw Peter Tobin, she said that that definitely wasn't the man that she shared the taxi with. That wasn't Bible John. However, she did say this 40 years after sharing that taxi ride with him, and that was just one night. It wasn't like a face that she saw every day that she would definitely recognise. She was quite drunk that night, she only saw him for a couple of hours that night, so how could she identify that face for definite 40 years later when she's much older? And I'm not trying to like purposefully discredit her account, I'm just saying that logically 40 years later, that is a long time for your memory to fade. And at the time of the murders, Peter Tobin was living in Glasgow, just a few miles away from the Barrowland Ballroom, which we know he was a regular attendee at. Like I said, in the late 60s he met his first wife Margaret there, so we know that he went there a lot. And subsequently when he and Margaret moved to England in 1969, that was when the Bible John killings stopped. So the significance of the women being on their periods might be down to a couple of reasons if Peter Tobin is Bible John. He hated it when his wives or girlfriends were on their periods. He would never let them use like sanitary towels or anything like that. He'd just let them bleed. Which, just as a side note, now that we know he's a serial killer, it's so eerie to know that he had that fascination with blood the whole time. He would also become violent when his wives and girlfriends were on their periods, but he would also rape them more. Another promising connection was Peter Tobin's religious roots. Like I said, he was Roman Catholic and kept them religious beliefs all the way through his life. Often when he was on the run from police, he would join a religious sect or a church like he did in 2007. It was just where he felt comfortable and where he felt like he could maintain a life. And as Helen's sister Jeannie said, this guy that she shared the taxi with was referencing the Bible quite a bit. As for that guy's name, Helen thought she remembered it as John Templeton, John Sempleson, John Emerson, something like that. And we know that Peter Tobin liked to use fake names a lot, but one of his kind of go-to fake names was John Semple. And Jeannie also said that the guy she shared this taxi ride with had an overlapping tooth in the top right of his mouth. And since the 60s, Peter Tobin has actually had a tooth removed from the top right of his mouth. Could that be the overlapping tooth? Because that's quite a standout feature of someone. How many people do you know that's got an overlapping tooth in the right top corner of their mouth? So as for reasons as to why Peter Tobin is probably not Bible John, obviously his hair and his height are way off. But there's also the mode of the killings. Bible John and Peter Tobin had completely different modes of killing. And usually serial killers, when they find something easy, something they're good at, something that they find enjoyment in, they will stick to that because that's obviously why they kill, because they find enjoyment in it. And so they'll find their way of killing and they will very rarely step out of the lines of that. And Peter Tobin's murders, for example, always had to involve blood, so stabbings or cutting up, knives, things like that. He liked to see blood, as we can tell. Whereas the Bible John murders never involved any weapons. He always just beat the women with his own hands and feet, and then he would strangle his victim with anything that he had on him, like his belt or their stocking. Peter Tobin also tried to hide every single one of his murder victims' bodies, either burying them in his garden or putting them under the floorboards of the church. But not Bible John. Bible John left his victims out purposefully. He even put the sanitary towel there for police to find because he wanted police to find these bodies. He didn't want to hide them. And that shows a complete different psychology in these killers. Like I said in my Bible John video, one of them wanted to see blood. He did it because he wanted to see blood. The other one just was happy strangling and beating. He didn't really care to see blood that much. One of them felt like he had to hide his crimes and hide the bodies, whereas the other one wanted police to find the bodies. Bible John went to the same Barrowland Ballroom every single time he wanted to pick up a victim. He was very cocky in that way. He didn't try to avoid police. Whereas Peter Tobin was constantly moving around, changing his name, trying to avoid police detection, joining religious sects. They were completely different, completely different. Yet the most promising piece of evidence as to why Peter Tobin is not Bible John is actually a DNA sample. Like I said, all of the Bible John victims were raped and semen samples were taken from each of their bodies. However, only the last one from Helen Puttock was good enough to be tested. In 2007, it was tested against the National DNA Database that we know Peter Tobin is in, yet no match was found. So then it was tested specifically against Peter Tobin's DNA, yet still no match was found. It was not Peter Tobin's DNA. Of course, there's the possibility that she could have had sex with someone else and the semen could have got on a stocking somehow. However, with the circumstance that she was murdered, we can probably guess that that semen did come from her attacker. And the police force itself is pretty much polarised on the matter. Half and half believe that Peter is Bible John and half believe that he can't be Bible John. If Peter Tobin was Bible John, that would mean that he committed his first murder at 22 years old, which does sound a lot more likely. Because as I've said a million times in this video, he started, or seemed to have started, pretty late in life. Okay, so that's it for Bible John, and now for some updates on Peter Tobin and his life and his family. It seems that Peter's niece, Jade Jackson, is actually following in his psychopathic footsteps. In 2016, 20-year-old Jade Jackson harassed and threatened a 12-year-old girl over the span of 4 months because she believed that this 12-year-old girl was talking to her 20-year-old boyfriend. Jade got this girl's Snapchat and was sending her pictures holding up a blade saying how she wanted to slash her, and one of the pictures was captioned, "It'll be cool to see the blood pouring from you." Jade would send this girl, almost half her age, between 5 and 10 snaps every single day saying that she'd messed with the wrong person, threatening all sorts of violence towards this girl and her whole family. So after the picture with the blade, this girl finally told her mum what was going on and they got the police involved, and Jade served 9 months in prison for these threats. And since then she's been in constant trouble with the police for racist attacks, theft, threats, violence, all sorts. So as for Peter Tobin himself, in 2015, aged 69, he was actually attacked by a fellow inmate in his sleep. Sean Moynihan was a double rapist who held his victims at knife point, and he said that he was infuriated with Tobin. Like I said, Peter Tobin claims he killed 48 women, yet he won't tell police where any of the bodies are, he won't tell them names, anything. He also said to police that he doesn't give a fuck about his victims' families. And so this infuriated Sean Moynihan, and so he decided that he was going to attack Peter Tobin and possibly try and kill him. So he made his own weapon. It was a blade fitted with a handle, and then he went to Peter Tobin's prison cell around lunchtime. Tobin was actually asleep at the time when Sean approached him and began slashing his face and his neck. So Tobin obviously woke up and struggled with Sean for a while until Sean finally left his cell, and then Tobin sounded his cell alarm. And the officers responding to Tobin's cell alarm actually passed Sean in the hallway on their way to his cell, and Sean had blood all over him and the blade still in his pocket, but police didn't notice. And as soon as Tobin told them what had just gone on, they ran straight to Sean's cell, who just said to them, "I slashed Tobin across the face and throat." Just so calmly. Tobin was left with a 20cm long deep slash all across his cheek and onto his neck. It required immediate treatment obviously, and it's left him with a huge disfiguring scar. Sean was sentenced to a further 2.5 years on top of his sentence for that attack, and ever since then Peter Tobin hasn't been the same. Sources say that he's become a nervous wreck ever since the attack, and he barely leaves his cell, and due to his anxiety he can't even eat with the other prisoners anymore. He gets his food brought to his cell so that he can stay away from other prisoners. So Peter Tobin is currently 72 years old, he's very frail and in quite bad health, he still has his heart problems and actually recently had a stroke. But yeah, that is everything for this case. I feel like this one has been so long. Do you think Peter Tobin is Bible John now? After hearing the rest of this story and maybe a little bit more information. I don't know if I included all of that information in the Bible John video, but yeah, it is currently 4 in the morning, so I'm gonna go to bed. I've literally been sat in this chair for 5 hours. 5 hours filming this video, so I don't know how long it is. If it's been super long, I'm sorry, but it probably hasn't even turned out that long because I have a stutter and half of my recording is probably just me messing up. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a thumbs up and subscribe down below because I'm doing a full 10 days of terror did I mention that at the start of this video? I'm doing 10 Days of Terror every single day up until Halloween, and on Halloween I am going to be uploading a new true crime video, and I mean there's only 3 days left of it after this, but subscribe anyway. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for a brand new true crime video. Bye!